Greetings, netizens of YouTube. The presidential nomination in the US has never failed to grasp my attention. From the perspective of an outsider, the campaign, which resembles a drama-ridden marathon rather than a short sprint, is quite fascinating. The experience of many Americans switching off their televisions and monitors, exasperated with their politicians and the way the media covers them, is probably more of a mundane slog. From a Democratic perspective, there is only one question. Are you for Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton? In an increasingly bitter race between the two candidates, or at least their supporters, I think it's time to take a step back from the bluster and to focus on policy differences between Hillary and Bernie supporters. The way I'm going to structure this is to present a number of questions on policy, and I'd like you to think about your position on the question in hand before considering what you believe either candidate supports. Feel free to tell me in the comments section your opinion on those questions, because you can be damn certain I'm going to tell you mine. I will reveal the results after that. On May the 17th, the Pew Research Center published their survey of registered Democratic or Democratic-leaning voters, which was conducted in March and April of 2016. The questions asked included whether they thought the US military campaign against ISIS are not going too well or not going at all well, cut back US defense spending, whether US efforts to solve world problems usually make things worse, whether anti-terrorism policies have gone too far in restricting civil liberties, whether people are concerned that the US will get too involved in military action in Syria and Iraq, whether one sympathizes more with Palestinians than with Israel, whether involvement with the global economy has been a bad thing for the US. The military campaign against ISIS. As can be seen by these media reports or communiques, a superficial impression would be that the US is taking decisive action against ISIS. But how many times have we heard this about military campaigns before? The real barometer of success against ISIS, as far as people of the world are concerned, is to prevent or to stamp out terrorist attacks. Following 9/11, people in the US are nervous and eye attacks in the UK, Belgium or France with, if not fear, then foreboding. As I write this, we have a missing passenger jet, and the suspicions are that terrorists have struck again. The US military campaign isn't going too well. No. More emphasis on intelligence gathering and diplomacy, please. Frankly, the effect of watching the grainy footage of supposed precision missiles hit their targets on TV has worn off. Whether US efforts to solve world problems usually makes things worse. This is a difficult question. It's quite easy to bring up numerous countries that have suffered more problems following US military involvement or of, quote, diplomatic, unquote, intervention. It's true that a proportion of those countries would likely have experienced a worsening economic or military situation even without US efforts. It's also true that we are less likely to hear about US efforts that actually have a positive impact on the world. However, the fact is that US efforts to solve world problems usually does make things worse, in my opinion. This leads to another question, though. Does any country's effort to solve world problems not usually make things worse? And do we think that if the US takes a step back, that other countries will not step into the vacuum to exercise their influence? From my perspective, it's not enough to blame the US for making world problems worse, and to insist upon the US retreating from this position. There must be a concerted attempt by the US and other world powers to gain common agreement that the people of the world will not suffer from intervention from any countries. After all, it makes no difference to citizens of the world whether the US, Russia or China is trying to, quote, solve their problems, unquote. Easier said than done. The rule should be that unless there are exceptional circumstances, the US and other countries would do well to stop meddling in the affairs of other states. Cut back US defense spending. Yes, The priority should be public services, and money saved should go towards budgets such as education or health. Yes, it would be foolhardy to make drastic reductions in defense spending unilaterally. But as a global leader, the US should sit down with international partners and try to agree a common reduction in military spending. They did and are still doing it with the START agreements on reducing the number of nuclear missiles that the US and Russia produce. So I see no reason why such an agreement can't be extended to include other weapons or include other countries such as China. Whether anti-terrorism policies have gone too far in restricting civil liberties. Yes, absolutely. Let's not be unrealistic. Terrorism is now a fact of life, and some compromises have to be made, but there is no question that civil liberties have been restricted beyond a reasonable level. It began with the passing of the Patriot Act in 2001, as far as the US is concerned anyway, and even covered the ability to wiretap, surveil, and track individuals who are not members of terrorist groups. It's true that this type of legislation might enable the authorities to better prevent lone wolf terrorists acting alone, but in reality, does anyone doubt that this is used to infringe upon the rights of ordinary Americans wrongly suspected of terrorism? In the UK, we had so-called control orders, which meant that those suspected of involvement in terrorism would have some of their human rights suspended. Human rights groups such as Amnesty International have condemned these and other restrictions in civil liberties. There is a sense that behind the scenes the government has too much control and are exploiting the security situation for their own ends rather than the benefit of the people. What government wouldn't like more control over its citizens after all, even if individual members of that government have convinced themselves it's for the good of those citizens? Are people concerned the US will get too involved in military action in Syria and Iraq? Yes, I'm concerned about that. History has shown that once the US starts down this path, it usually follows through for good or ill. The wider question of what is to be done with Syria is a complex one. In the absence of any common agreement, if the US does withdraw, Russia will increase its chances of dictating policy in the region. It can be said, however, that Western foreign policy on Syria has been an unmitigated disaster. Some would apply that sentiment to the Middle East generally. Whether one sympathizes more with Palestinians than with Israel. This is an interesting question because it's unintentionally, I think, loaded. The Palestinians are people. Israel is a country. In fact, in the minds of many, if you are talking about Israel, you are talking about the Israeli government. Suffice to say, not many people are sympathetic with that government. Aside from that, yes, I admit to being more sympathetic towards Palestinians than I am towards Israelis. To my mind, the creation of Israel without the permission of those living in Palestine at the time was a historic injustice, and we are still seeing the repercussions of that today. At the same time, I don't think that the US has played the role of honest broker between the Israelis and Palestinians. Rather, the US has propped up Israel with vast amounts of financial and military aid. That is not to say that I believe that Israel should be dismantled, or that I in any way support acts of violence against Israelis. I sympathize with Israelis living in that situation, particularly those that grew up in that environment. Just as we can't blame ordinary Palestinians for a hardline position, we can't blame ordinary Israelis for a hardline one either. Both communities still feel like they are mortally endangered by the other. Involvement with the global economy has been a bad thing for the US. This is a question I have a hard time understanding. Unless I'm not reading between the lines, my answer is no. Involvement with the global economy hasn't been a bad thing for the US. If anything, the opposite is true. US companies have flourished in the global market. I'm wondering if this is about protectionism. Essentially, the government protecting certain industries in the US due to the fact that those industries can't compete in the global market, which would mean further job losses. This is a valid concern, as we've seen many jobs outsourced in recent years. But the thing people don't understand about protectionism is that for every government that implements such a policy, another government around the world will retaliate. This means that US companies that export to countries protecting certain industries won't be able to compete, and employees in those US companies will lose jobs instead. It will also mean that items you buy in the shops produced abroad will become more expensive. There is sometimes a case for protectionism, but people should be under no illusions that it is without costs. And that's coming from somebody who is no friend of laissez-faire economic policy. The only other angle to this question would be global recession. The idea, or I should say fantasy, that the US will be better off if it adopts an insular economic policy and that somehow it will be less exposed to international instability. The problem here is that global economic problems start in the US as much as they do anywhere else. The problem is capitalism, or neoliberal economics, the foundation of international economic policy, which comes primarily from the United States and the United Kingdom. Being less involved with the global economy would not stop the disparities in income, monopolies, and corruption. All are an integral part of a system that these countries have chosen for the world. It feels a little to me like bolting the door shut and hoping that the bad outside world can't get in, only to find that the monster is living in the basement. The results are as follows. 38% of Clinton supporters think that the campaign against ISIS isn't going too well or at all well, compared to 62% of Sanders supporters. 25% of Clinton say cut back defense spending, while 43% of Sanders say cut back defense spending. 28% Clinton say US efforts to solve world problems make things worse, versus 45% Sanders. 35% Clinton say anti-terrorism policies have gone too far, restricting civil liberties. 51% Sanders say the same thing. 53% Clinton say US will get too involved in military action in Iraq and Syria, with 68% Sanders agreeing. 27% Clinton sympathise more with Palestinians than Israel, compared to 39% Sanders. It's interesting that the support for Israel over the Palestinians is overwhelming among Democrats as well as Republicans. 37% Clinton say US involvement in the global economy has been a bad thing for the US, versus 48% Sanders. In my opinion, the figures speak for themselves and reflect slightly different values among Bernie and Hillary supporters. While it's true that we are talking about the positions of Democratic-leaning voters, so this isn't specifically about the policy positions of Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton, although I believe the views broadly represent the positions of Hillary and Bernie. Too much time is spent speculating who will win whichever primary, or whether one group of supporters are allegedly sexist, or if another group has hired an army of online bots to prop their positions up. It's understandable, stimulating, and sometimes emotionally edifying, but in the final analysis what matters is the policy positions of the candidates and their previous record. There are many other factors, such as trust, authenticity, experience, or the ability to rise above partisanship, or to sell out your principles depending on your perspective, and of course, who has the better chance of winning the presidency itself. Bernie versus Hillary? Who do I support? I think it's quite obvious. Perhaps I'll do another video before the Democratic convention, if the race lasts that long. I have held policy positions on a number of issues for many years, and I am delighted that a Democratic candidate has appeared who seems genuinely to share some of those positions. The real question is, who do you support? But more importantly, which candidate you are closer to in policy or values.